The FDA has approved the antiviral drug remdesivir as a treatment for patients hospitalized with COVID-19. This comes as more than 8.4 million Americans have tested positive for coronavirus since the start of the pandemic, and more than 223,000 people have died across the country. Remdesivir is now the first and only fully approved treatment in the U.S. for coronavirus. For more on this, we are joined by Dr. Bob Lahita. Dr. Bob, the World Health Organization recently said that remdesivir is among 4 other antiviral drug treatments that failed to show effectiveness in hospital in patients with COVID-19. So what can you tell us about the drug so far?
Well, we've been using it, Vlad, for many, many months. I have been using remdesivir since March. And so it is effective by our gauging the activity of the patients that come into the hospital who are dreadfully ill. We don't use it as a rule for outpatients. We use it for inpatients along with the steroid dexamethasone. And remdesivir has shown significant effect in a large number of patients, not all patients, but a large number. It still depends. Now, this is an antiviral, remember, it's not an immunosuppressive. It's an antiviral. The dexamethasone is an immunosuppressive. So it does have activity, but not in everybody. And it's nice to see that the FDA has finally approved it. We've been using it, as I said, for many months, Vlad.
Pfizer announced that it's expanding its COVID-19 vaccine trial to include teens. Now, children and teenagers have previously been off limits in the vaccine conversation. Can you give us some context, when it comes to this sudden change? And quite frankly, I would think it's challenging to find volunteers for this. I know as a parent, I don't think I would, my kid's not a teenager, but I don't think I would, volunteer my child for something like this.
Yeah, Anne-Marie, it's important that children be included in these clinical trials. Why? Because they're going to be among the first who are immunized. There's several things to consider. One, the dose of the vaccine is not going to be the same dose that one gives to adults. Children are going to get a different dose, a much lower dose of vaccine. Children generally have very robust immune systems, so they are going to respond very well to the vaccine with few exceptions. Now, it's important to have them as a cohort to immunize. Why? Because they're in contact with their parents, their grandparents, and in school with their teachers. So we would like to have them among the first that are protected. It's very, very important, Anne-Marie, to consider that. So this is a major thing. Most pediatricians agree with me that children should be in the clinical trial group. And I agree with you. It's a little bit how shall we say, a little bit chancy to have a parent agree to have their child immunized, but a lot of times the parent and the child are both immunized at the same time. And we're talking everybody above the age of, say, 16 or 17 right now. We're not talking about little children, which is going to be in the next cohort.
So, Dr. Bob, a study out of the UK found that people with Down syndrome are at 5 times the risk for COVID-19 associated hospitalization and 10 times the risk for deaths linked to the disease. What can you tell us about the risk factor among those with the syndrome?
Yes, Vlad, that's a very interesting study in the Annals of Internal Medicine. And there were something like 8,260,000 people in a cohort in the United Kingdom. And of that, there were 4,053 Downs patients. And 68 of those Down syndrome patients died of COVID. Now, we know that children with Down syndrome, or anybody with Down syndrome, actually have cardiovascular, pulmonary, and probably and most likely immunologic problems, errors of metabolism. The immunologic, I will call it a glitch, if you will, because we haven't really put our finger on what the immunologic difficulty is in a patient with Downs, but they're not considered in the high-risk group, and they should be, because this is a group of young people that would easily succumb to the COVID infection. And this is apparent now from this new paper that just came out. 39.7% of those 4,053 children with Down syndrome died of COVID, and the rest of pneumonia and other various things like cardiovascular disease. So it is a risky group, Vlad.
Doctor, as you know, Europe is fighting what looks to be the second wave of the virus. A number of countries and cities have started to enforce these lockdown restrictions that we saw during the first wave. There's a lot of fatigue, but it's very concerning when you see the numbers tick up. And I'm wondering, are we looking at our future when we look at what's happening in Europe right now? Is this what's going to be coming to the United States, I don't know, in a few months?
Well, Anne Marie, I've been saying that since we've been speaking on Fridays, that with the cold weather and people grouping inside their homes and having the holidays like Thanksgiving and the Christmas holidays, it presents a tremendous risk, particularly among families, where you go from the smallest child, infant, right up to grandma, who may be in her 80s and 90s. And so this is a big issue. This issue also is compounded by the fact that influenza is going to be present as we move forward into winter. So everybody should have their flu shot. But yeah, this is a big possible second surge. We're seeing still less people in the hospital, less people on ventilators, but we have ticked up a couple of degrees. We went from like 2.5% to upwards of 4% now hospitalizations, which indicates that, yes, we see an increase in the number of patients. But if you listen to the president last night, he said, well, the reason we have more patients that are numerous is because we're testing more. Now, that may be the case. I'm not certain of that, but we're certainly seeing, just as in Europe, we're seeing an uptick. Not as bad as Europe, but getting there. Anne Marie?
Yeah, just to fine point on that, the president repeats that over and over again. We're testing more, thus we have more cases. If we didn't test, we wouldn't have any cases. Dr. Bob, I just turned 50. If I don't get a colonoscopy, that does not mean I probably am not in trouble. I mean, just because I don't get tested for it doesn't mean I might not be sick. That's
right. You're absolutely right, Vlad. Testing really is not the parameter that we are looking at. You can get sick. You don't, that is not figured into the overall number. So you're at risk regardless.
Leaving our viewers with that image.
And we should point out that we're seeing increases in hospitalizations and in deaths. So if you don't want to go by the testing, because you say more people are getting tested, so we're uncovering the virus more, then just look at the people who are suffering the most, the people who find themselves in the hospital. When you see those numbers are going up, it's not about testing.
That's right.
People are getting sick, more of them.
That's right. And believe it or not, a lot of people are not coming into the hospital because they're afraid to come into the hospital. So believe it or not, people are actually staying at home, and that very small number that stay at home actually die at home before they even get to the hospital. So one thing we have to tell people, if you're short of breath, if you're running a fever, if you have a dry cough, if you have a headache, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, do go to the hospital emergency room. Don't be afraid. We have all kinds of procedures to protect you. If you don't have COVID, we'll let you know.
Great advice. Dr. Bob Lahita, thank you as always, my friend. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you, Vlad. Thank you, Anne Marie.
All right, let's go back to our top